what I'd ask either one or a couple of you to address are, do you work with folks who are just BA grads and don't have a master's degree? And are there entry-level opportunities for folks with a bachelor's degree and not necessarily a master's?
I can speak on that briefly. So JLARC traditionally has only been folks with master's degrees, not specifically MPPs. We have some MPAs, a couple MBAs, and actually 1 or 2 social work and MPH now. So there's kind of a broad range, but traditionally and historically, it's always been only folks with a master's degree, but that's actually something that they have had a little more flexibility on fairly recently. Our most recent recruiting cycle, they were looking at folks without an advanced degree as well, and seeing value in that.
I'll jump in on my office. The Fiscal Research Division at this point really only hires people with an advanced degree, be it Master's Public Policy, MPA. We even have some PhDs. But occasionally I'll work with, in a state agency, someone who has a BA. Typically, those folks are usually on the partisan side of things and less sort of the non-partisan, I don't know, program administration kind of role. For example, I had a meeting with the Lieutenant Governor's office last week, and much of his staff is policy folks who have a bachelor's and not a master's.
Yeah, and looking at our policy team in the policy office, I'd say it's about half and half have some sort of graduate degree, and some others just have bachelor's degree. It's definitely not, I don't think anybody gets turned away for not having a master's degree. So you can definitely, if you've got the skills and the background and the experiences that would make you a good fit for the work that we do, then that never gets held back. But I think when you look at a lot of some of the more senior members of the administration higher up, except for in the pure communication space, most folks have some sort of either master's in public administration, public policy, or law degree.
Okay, great, thanks. And again, I'll let you guys fight it out who talks first. But what is it about state government that you find particularly rewarding, challenging? Why do you think you gravitated toward state government versus, say, the local level or the federal level? I mean, Ashley, you touched it. I think it was you that touched on it briefly, but can you kind of expand on just that question of what is it about state government that you find rewarding?
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, I was, during my time at Batten, I was a generalist, and the main classes I took were, the state budget course. I took like an Excel class. I took fiscal policy analysis courses, and I felt kind of out of place, not knowing like my key area of expertise. But a lot of credit goes to Professor Shapak. If anybody decides to take state budgeting with Professor Shapak, he basically revealed or helped me realize that, budget is a really critical tool of state government to move policy forward. And if you're able to get a hold of this very confusing, really bureaucratic process, you can be a part of really cool change. And I think that I started this role last June. I've been remote since I've started, and it's been crazy to see how I've been able to be a part of Health and Human Services work with, behavioral health issues, Department of Children and Families, but also I think COVID has presented a lot of huge budget questions for state governments. We're seeing a huge influx of federal funds come to states for the very first time, like billions of dollars. And, as Batten students, you are equipped with the quantitative skills and the communication skills to think about good processes and good governance to help serve the public. So it's been really exciting to see how the skills that we use at Batten, even if you don't have like a specific policy area that you're interested in, the tools you have can help you make really positive change in state government.
I'll just add, the reason I ended up kind of in state government is I knew I wanted to go into public service and wanted to be in a role that where I could really make an impact, like Ashley was talking about. And so I wanted to be in government in some respect, but frankly, I knew I didn't want to be in DC, which pretty quickly ruled out most federal government options. And so I ended up in state government. I don't want to say by default because that's not quite right, but it worked out well in that I could be in a place where I could make some change. And also state government tends to move a little bit more quickly. So I could see the impact more and more readily. And that is how I ended up in Richmond after graduation.
One last thing I'll add on my end is I got some advice when I was summer 2016 when I was doing the Governor's Fellows program from somebody who ended up being my boss the next year. She had come to Richmond right after Governor Kane's race to become governor. And what she told me was, when you're making up your decision or your mind between wanting to do DC and federal government in the Hill, or come to Richmond and do state government, governor's office, General Assembly work, you coming to Richmond, you get the chance to be like a bigger fish in a smaller pond where there is, so much work to be done and just fewer people coming to do it. So you inevitably get to take on a lot more responsibilities and get a lot more, hands-on experience right out the gate. And I found that I listened to that advice and I found it to be 100% true. I don't think some of the experiences that I would have gotten over the last 4 years would have been ones that I would have gotten as immediately as I had I gone up to the Hill or had I gone up to a federal agency. And so for me, that's kind of the biggest, pointer I'll give for wanting to do state government.
And I'll put maybe kind of a last point, combining everything that my peers have said. There's, you wear a lot of hats, you're closer to the action, so to speak. It might feel less abstract. Maybe you don't want to be in DC, but all that being said, it's still kind of the major leagues. I mean, in North Carolina, it's a state of 10.5 million people, and there's a general fund budget of about $25 billion. The population is a number I can't even conceive of. 10.5 million is so many people, and then 25 billion in a general fund state budget, let alone some of the non-general fund stuff that the state does. It's really immense. So you get to wear a lot of hats, but you're also still working on something that's really so large. So for me, it was that perfect blend of being able to do more, see more, and even say more with the opportunity that I have directly with legislators, while still feeling like I'm doing something that has an impact on a lot of people.
Great. And Connor, I know this isn't a Governor's Fellow marketing panel, but you've mentioned it a couple of times, and we have a number of students that participate in that program. So can you just briefly explain the Virginia Governor's Fellows program?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think my year, there were 4 or 5 of us from Batten, from UVA, that had done it. Usually it's a class of somewhere between 20 and 30 students. Vast majority come from Virginia's colleges and universities, and it's a mix of rising 4th years graduate students and recent graduates. Basically, you apply for the Governor's Fellows program and get placed into one of the governor's cabinet secretary's offices for the summer. Each of them get 2 or 3 Governor's Fellows, and then Lieutenant Governor's office also gets one, and it's separate from the Fellows program that runs through the Attorney General's office. But basically, you get it's a great opportunity to meet all the folks that work in the Patrick Henry building in the governor's office, as well as working in a secretariat that you might be interested in that sort of policy field. It's a good chance to meet a lot of the folks that work at those agencies, and get your foot in the door there.
Great. I'm sure the Governor's Fellows program would appreciate your marketing pitch. And I would absolutely highly recommend it, whether you're a Batten student or not. Obviously, it's a great opportunity. We've got clearly some current Batten students and some prospective Batten students, considering, and I think newly admitted. Thinking back to your time with us, and Ashley, you mentioned Professor Shapak's class. so for all of you, maybe some particular classes or more broadly, the skill sets that you got either in Batten classes or just in general here, at UVA that you're using day to day or that have paid dividends.
I went last time. I'll go first this time. Couple right off the bat, the Virginia Politics and Policy class with Professor Pennick. I loved that class. It's really student driven. You'll get a lot of say over what you cover in that class, and it was really one of the more instrumental parts in me deciding to go the route of state government after graduation. So very hands-on. Really recommend it. Skills based. I think all of the research methods and data analysis classes, even when you can get to the elective level, I think are really helpful, because even if you're not a producer of research in your career, the more you can learn about the production of research, the more you can be a better consumer of research, especially if you're evaluating program effectiveness or making policy decisions where you're reading other people's work. I think that coursework is very helpful. And then the last thing I'll sort of plug is any of the policy clinics that you can get into, where you're working with maybe the city of Charlottesville or something at the state level, where you sort of have a client and you're working on a program or a problem. I think that one is a great educational experience on what it's like to kind of be boots on the ground. And two, when you eventually have job interviews and you're looking at what you're going to do after Batten, having that sort of hands-on experience is a great thing to have experience with and be able to talk about as you look ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with actually a lot of what Grant said. We had a lot of some very similar points. I also took Professor Pennick's Virginia Politics and Policy course and loved it. If you're interested at all in state government, I would definitely recommend taking that course. And the foundation of economics and research methods that Batten provides is really helpful. And at JLARC in my role, we do a lot of quantitative analysis, so I'm using that almost every day. But even if you're not in a role that's super quant heavy, just having that foundation and that understanding and being able to digest research and be skeptical of research that you're reading because you understand those theories underlying it, I think is really, really valuable. And then a class that actually, the Introduction to Public Policy course in the undergrad track, I always kind of think back to, even sort of unconsciously, just some of the conversations that we have in that class about the different levers that government can take to affect change, taxes versus incentives. Those kind of things are something that I think about all the time when we're doing a study and we have our findings, and then kind of the next step is setting up those recommendations and thinking about what can government do and what is feasible, what's kind of the full scope of the options, but then, all right, what's actually the scope of the options we have available? And some of those intro classes are really foundational as well. And several of those, they at least were, I imagine still are, open to students even before you're officially in Batten. So if you're interested in Batten undergrad or MPP, if you're considering taking Batten courses, those are ones you can get into more readily.
I'll totally agree with everything Grant said about Virginia politics and policy, and what Danielle said about that class. That was one of my favorites. Professor Pennick takes you on a trip to Richmond, where you get to meet a lot of legislators, folks in the administration, and folks throughout state government that talk to you directly about the projects that you're working on that you have chosen to do. So it's a very cool class. And again, agree with everything Ashley said about the budget class. That was very helpful for me. Another third one just to throw in there was Warburg's Congress class. Obviously I don't work on the Hill, but that class was a great exposure to the processes, procedures, and just general rules of a legislative body. And obviously in Virginia, we have different sets of rules than Congress has, but it was a great opportunity to learn about how those bodies function, and to get a sense of what working in those arenas look like.
Okay, great. I have, some additional questions, but I also want to allow some of our guests to ask questions. So I'll keep asking, but if you'd like to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat or just come off mute and ask your question, or raise your hand, or whatever you want to do. But feel free at any point from this point forward to chime in if you have a question for any one of our panelists. Were there some co-curricular activities while you were here, like so outside your actual classes, whether that be CIOs or other activities you participated in that you find or did find particularly helpful once you left here?
The first that comes to mind isn't actually, it's not Batten specific, and it's not truly a CIO, but I think it still relates. I think any opportunity that you have to get involved in the Charlottesville community is really, really beneficial. I volunteered with the Shelter for Help in Emergency, which is the women's shelter in Charlottesville, which was wonderful experience. One, because you get out of that UVA bubble, but then also you can see some of the impacts of policy on actual folks, even if that experience is not policy driven or policy focused, but just it exposes you to different types of people and helps me keep that perspective of, when we're working on policy, what impact will this have on real people? So any opportunity to do that, I would recommend you do.
I had a question.
Sure, Leah, go ahead.
I was just kind of wondering, because I'm a fourth year and I'm applying to things right now. And I was just kind of wondering what your experience with sort of like the timeline was, like when you started looking at state government, when was too early, when was too late. And then I was also just curious obviously with like Virginia, but with other states too, sort of like if you had state ties or if you found that wasn't necessarily something that was like super emphasized in the recruitment process.
One thing I'll say, and thanks for your question, Leah, about the recruitment process is that it felt a lot more personal to me than I applied to a few jobs in DC, consulting or federal government, whatever, when I still thought I might be interested in that. But when I applied to work down here in North Carolina, a group of folks came to Batten to speak to students. So I guess I developed a connection with some of the folks who were on the hiring team then. But I was able to, before I submitted my application, call them on the phone, talk to them about what the work would be like, talk through what kind of fit I might be there, which was totally separate from the interview. I sent in my application and I had an interview, but it was more personal. And I think that that's beneficial in the process to determine on both sides if you'll be a good fit for them and if they'll be a good fit for you. And I think that's probably missing with some of the federal jobs or larger hires. As for timeline, I think it probably varies a lot by different states and by different state agencies. I applied to the job I have now probably in February of 2018, was interviewed in March and heard back in April. So it was kind of a 2-month or so process, but I imagine there's a lot of variety out there. So I'll let other folks chime in with their experiences.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for JLARC, at least, there's not really a strong emphasis on having a Virginia connection. One to, someone that works at JLARC or in-state government, for example, is not needed, certainly. But then also we hire folks that do not live in Virginia and have never lived in Virginia. So that even isn't really something they look at or evaluate super closely. In terms of the recruitment timeline, I think the length of time for mine was pretty similar to Grant's. It was about 2 months. I interviewed embarrassingly early. I was on like the Virginia State Jobs Board and saw the posting in November, which is not when JLARC typically is recruiting new grads. They were just trying to fill a vacancy that they had, and they got me instead. So I applied in November, interviewed, I think at the very end of November, and had an offer by the end of December, right around the new year. But like I said, that's not typical for JLARC. We typically do recruiting for new grads in the early spring. So I think we're starting to wrap that up now, but like we're pretty solidly in our recruitment window right now.
I'll also add that I was connected to a job here in Rhode Island through Professor Pennick. And so if you are interested in state government, the professors at Batten are always really, really excited to get Batten folks into state government. I know both Professor Shapak and Professor Pennick are great resources. And obviously Steve and Hannah are here. So career services is always an amazing resource. And my timeline was similar to Danielle and Grant. I also applied in the springtime.
Oh, and I'll also add that Professor Pennick actually used to work for the Fiscal Research Division in North Carolina, and I guess he's the relationship with the office that caused the recruiting visit in the first place. So I absolutely agree with Ashley. Batten professors and their experiences are a big gateway into these jobs, but also just knowing about the universe of jobs that does exist, because it's hard to know sometimes until someone says, hey, you might be a good fit in XYZ.
Connor, I guess you're in more of a quote unquote political type role, and I assume your internship bore on your eventual hire, but do you want to maybe talk briefly about people who are maybe a little closer to the political aspect of the governor's office versus, the other three I look at and see typical, maybe longer term government employees?
Yeah, definitely. So unlike jobs that you would get hired at a classified level at an agency, the job I'm in is a political at-will appointee job. So basically, I can be hired and fired on the spot without having to go through an interview process or anything. So for me, how I got this one, obviously, like I said, that summer was a foot in the door for me. And that last year at Batten, I actually did, I was in Richmond every Monday and Tuesday of my second semester, doing an internship with the Secretary of Education's office, and doing some work for folks around here. So for me, since I was in and around the administration, when a position opened up in Governor McAuliffe's policy office, I just got a call one day asking if I would be interested, and the process just kind of went from there, and it was a series of informal conversations, and then I had it a little bit before graduation, so don't tell anybody, but I had to cut class for a little bit and take my exams on the road. But Batten was super accommodating for that and helped me out. And that's pretty similar throughout the whole administration. All of us are appointed. There are a few classified jobs. There are a few jobs that are, they're kind of a weird blend between being hired by an agency and then being on loan in the governor's office, which happens a lot. So those are more permanent people, but they might have appointed positions within the governor's office. So it's just a little bit of a different world when it comes to the jobs prospects.
Okay, and Sharam, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, has a somewhat related question, but you're all MPP grads, so would one of you tackle that? And his question is our MPP program domestically focused on the US, or could you use it in a broader context?
I think I did not take very many electives that were not domestically focused, but they are there. The coursework is it's giving you foundations that you can apply kind of regardless of where you're located, I would say, particularly in those core courses. And then there are some electives on foreign policy or international NGOs, for example. They kind of change semester to semester. So that experience is definitely there to be had, but there's no, that I know of, it's been a few years, so someone correct me if I'm wrong, there's no kind of formal international track, for example, but the experience is there to kind of craft if you want that experience and that expertise.
Okay, I'm gonna have to read this one out loud from Rachel. I've heard of people with the end goal of working in the nonprofit private sector choose to enter consulting after graduation as a way to build skills. Do you see that happening with state and federal government? For example, new graduates choosing to work in state government with the end goal of working at the federal level at a later time. Is it common for people to transition from federal, state, or vice versa? Or if you want to be at the federal level, is it better, more common to start right there? Who wants to take that one?
I can start. I think that's a great question. There are certainly folks who start in consulting either to build skills faster or frankly because it typically pays higher. And so that's, if you're starting with a higher salary, that's great for your career moving forward. So I think those are definitely considerations when people look at consulting first. But in terms of hopping between state and federal, and if there's kind of a right order to do those in, I haven't seen that. There are several, in terms of there being a right order. At JLARC, there are several folks who have been at the federal government, have been at OMB, for example, and then they come down to the state level. And there's also been folks that go the other direction. So I think either is perfectly fine. It's a very similar skill set in both places, right? So it's really just a matter of where you want to be physically, and then also kind of that level or that range of impact that we talked about and what you want in terms of federal or state.
I agree with Danielle completely. I don't think there is a wrong or a right or wrong order of operations with this. I will just add that with my office, we typically get people coming down from the federal level who want to work at the state level. We rarely see folks who want to go up to Washington from here. But one of our more senior folks used to work at the Office of OMB in Washington, the Office of Management and Budget. We have a newer person who used to work for Pew Research up in DC who just came down to work for us. We have someone who used to work for Deloitte in DC who just came down to work for us. I think for the reason of wanting to be more directly involved in the legislative process or in the budget making process or just in government in general, rather than feeling pretty abstracted at the federal level, especially in consulting. I was having a conversation with our analyst who just came over from Deloitte, who said that she was working on a really niche project that just felt like she was buried under layers and layers of bureaucracy, and that the results of her project maybe were never going to be heard at the federal level. And when she had the opportunity to come down and work with us, she was really excited about it. But I don't want to disparage federal government work because it's also very important, and we see it maybe now more than ever with the federal COVID response. But I guess I can't speak as much to that work.
Looks like Emily has a hand raised.
Hey, thank you for coming to talk to us or speaking to us virtually today. I know I've heard a lot of you say that you have a more broad portfolio, and that is kind of one of the appeals of maybe being at a state level. Is that something that you find that most, I guess, state-focused employees have? Or are there people who, if you're at Batten and I'm interested in these one or two policy areas, like, are there positions like that at the state level, or do you just kind of end up taking on a little bit more?
I feel like I keep chiming in first, but I will do it again. At JLARC specifically, we are almost all policy generalists, but I think it depends on what agency you're in and what kind of work you want to do. So there are certainly folks that go work on the state level for Department of Education, for example, or if you have a specific policy area, you can work in the executive branch in that agency. That's going to be typically going to be more project or program implementation and true administration rather than kind of the more evaluative policy work and policy analysis. There are certainly kind of policy shops within some of the bigger state agencies. But yeah, in my experience, most of us are generalists, but there are certainly state opportunities that are more policy focused in a specific policy area rather.
Yeah, Danielle hit the nail on the head with that explanation of the agency structure. And if you're interested in like ultimately the policy directors of every agency, they're going to have to be generalists for everything that could affect Department of Education or for everything that could affect Department of Housing and Community Development. But underneath them, like Danielle said, there are those specialists and those program managers. But if you're looking at jobs that are related to legislative affairs, those oftentimes end up having you can't be a specialist on one specific thing in one specific policy area. Like you can be a pro at education policy, but you need to understand everything that's going to affect the Department of Education.
Yeah, I'll quickly add, even though everybody at JLARC is policy generalists, or nearly everybody, we're now starting to get more niche work actually. So some people are kind of carving out specializations, but generally folks at JLARC are policy generalists. Depending on where you work, you can still ask to be on projects that kind of fall closer to the policy issues that you're interested in. So for example, I've done a study related to health policy for several years now because I know that's what I like. And as I do those, I gain expertise in that area. So even if the role is not specifically in one policy area, depending on the employer and kind of the variety of work, you may still be able to kind of carve that path for yourself, much like you would with electives at Batten, for example.
One last thing I'll add. I don't, you carve that path. I don't think it's particularly hard to carve that path either. I think you're not needing to, it depends, of course, on where you work, whether you're in an agency or in sort of a governor's office or at the General Assembly more generally. But, you can easily choose to be a generalist, and you can pretty easily choose to have a specific area that you're interested in. And hopefully, whatever employment situation you have, that they'll be able to really help you with those interests. And I think it's very possible.
Are there certain misperceptions about being a state employee, or things that you thought it was going to be like and it didn't turn out, or what you just hear around about, working for a state that didn't turn out to be true?
I'll jump in sort of to something I said earlier. It's still big. It's still a fairly big level of government with the dollar amounts, the number of people being served. So it's not, we talk about it being smaller and wearing a lot of hats, but it's not small. It's not $100,000. It's the scale is still immense. And then I'll say, this varies by job, but my salary is probably pretty competitive with, not to the absolute dollar amount, but still fairly competitive with some of the consulting salaries that you might see in DC, especially when you adjust for local cost of living in the Raleigh area versus the DC area. So it's not, while I do think public service and state government, it's a noble direction to take, the sacrifice isn't like some immense personal salary sacrifice.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah. Public service has this perception of being much lower compensation, and I don't think that's always true. And also, depending on where you are in government, there's much more flexibility around that. So for example, in Virginia, if you're in an executive branch, some of those pay increases are harder to make a case for, or you may be more closely tied to state employee budgets overall. But in the legislative branch, they have a lot more flexibility with our compensation. We get pretty regular raises, and like that, this perception that you can't make any money in government is not true, and also varies substantially depending on where in government you are. my salary is probably not the same as someone who goes to Deloitte straight out of school. And I don't want that to be the perception. They're different, but like Grant said, I think it's competitive, especially when you consider cost of living and also, frankly, work-life balance. There's several different considerations that build into that. So don't expect some stark number difference, and recognize that there are nuances behind that.
An unrelated misconception is, so I'm in the executive branch. The Office of Management and Budget is over all the different agencies, state agencies. And on my first day of work, my boss told me that the executive branch is not a monolith, and that basically every agency kind of acts like their own fiefdom. They have their own personalities and qualms with each other. And I thought that was so interesting because, when we think about big government, we think of like big gray buildings and everybody looks the exact same and they're little bureaucrats with their hats on. They all do their separate things. And I think the reason I bring this up is that Batten's program uniquely qualifies us to think about organizations as an adaptive body that has to solve unsolvable problems. And so instead of just thinking, the Department of Health operates the exact same way as the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, we are able to conceptualize, what is really causing the problems that are persistent in state government, and how can we address the root causes to create long-lasting change. And so I think that's been an exciting and kind of frustrating thing to learn about state government, is that these problems are hard to solve, but Batten has trained us uniquely to think about how to create lasting change.
Okay, great. I've got one more before we kind of wrap up, and if anyone else has one they want to sneak in, please do. Were there certain things you wish you had done at UVA in general, or of course you wish you had taken at Batten to better prepare you for what you're doing now and didn't do?
I wish I took state and federal budgeting with Professor Shapak. I'm in a state budget role and I never took that, and that's a real knock on my resume. And I know it would be helping me every day if I had. And even if you're not a budget person, just from what I hear about the class and from what I understand about my job, budget is policy. I mean, it is. Everything in government, dollars make most of government go around. And any idea, no matter how great it is, unless it has the force of dollars behind it, it isn't going to happen. So learning about budget, even if it feels like it might be dry, it will be so worth it for your career to spend some time with that. And I really wish I'd taken that class.
Okay. Nobody else? All right. So there's only a couple minutes left, and if there's no other questions, I'll just wrap it up with any parting thoughts, final thoughts, or thoughts in general for folks that are interested in this line of work, or just thoughts in general.
I would say if you're looking around, at jobs and you're interested in state government, don't be afraid to reach out to alumni that are in agencies that you're really interested in. That's something that I didn't do, and I wish I had. And I love JLARC, and I ended up, I think, in the right place. So I don't mean that I should have done it to get intel in that respect. But I have Batten students reach out fairly regularly when we're doing recruiting. And those are such fun conversations on my end to have, because I really enjoy what I do. And so I think folks are happy to talk to you about what they do if they like their job. And it's certainly not a heavy lift to just kind of tell somebody what you do every day, right? So you're not bothering someone typically when you ask for that conversation, and it can give you some really valuable insight into, this is what the job posting says, and this is generally what this agency does. But being able to talk to somebody about, okay, what do you actually do day to day is really, really valuable insight. So I would just say, don't be afraid to have those conversations and send somebody, an email or LinkedIn message or whatever it is to connect and get a better sense of what their job looks like.
My piece of advice, I didn't apply to that many state jobs because thankfully I got this one before I sent too many other applications out. But in your job searches, look at state job boards in the Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, whatever area. Look, just look at all of them. Try to expand your net, and you might find something that is really hands-on and really cool that you never would have even thought of. Just get on some state job boards and apply.
Yeah, and one last piece for me is I started doing it more towards the end of my Batten career, but really utilize all the resources you've got at Batten, from the career folks all the way to each of your professors. A lot of them, before they were professors in the academic setting, were on the ground doing work for state agencies, for governments, for nonprofits, and their experiences and the contacts that they have are immensely useful as you're beginning the job search and looking around.
Yeah, I think mine is very, I guess, elementary advice, but it's just go to office hours. I think that and office hours, go to office hours for your professors, but also your TAs and anybody who seems like they know what they're doing in a class. Ask them to teach you how to do it. I think that's something that I really appreciated about Batten is the sense of community, that we're all just trying to figure this out together. And I went to a lot of econ office hours and a lot of RMDA office hours, and it was really great to have patient people come alongside me and help me grow. And so I'm grateful for, TAs and also professors who I went to their office hours and asked for career advice regularly, because I was brand new to this. And so I encourage you all to do the same, because you'll find career ideas and pathways that you wouldn't have otherwise found.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of tell this story, but Ashley talks about sort of the community at Batten. 3 people from Batten were hired in my cohort in North Carolina. And when they came down to it, it was like 5 people from UVA and 5 people from Duke who applied for this final spot. And they said they took all 3 of us in part because we all seemed so supportive of each other. And maybe at Duke there is a lot of teamwork, and it just didn't show through with the 5 people that they interviewed. But it sounds like it's special and a little bit unique how much community there is at Batten, and that pays off while you're there, and that pays off after, and it pays off into your future.
I would also say we've been talking a lot about how, go to your professors to get advice on where to apply, and kind of pick their brain on what the options are, which is brilliant and you should do. I think you can also lean on your professors once those offers start coming back in. Obviously, talk to career services as well. That's what they're there for. But Andy Pennick had many conversations with me, both about what roles would be good fits, and then also when I got offers back, is this compensation fair? Are they, he's like, state employee salaries are posted online. Make sure that they are compensating you like they would a male candidate coming in, for example, or, just things like that you may not be thinking of as someone who's new or newer to the workforce. Professors and career services and folks at Batten can be helpful through that full kind of process from application to acceptance, not just on finding where to apply and kind of the interview prep phase.
Okay. And we didn't pay her to say that either, by the way. So, all right. Well, I'll just go around the way the boxes are on my screen. Grant and Ashley and Danielle and Connor, we certainly thank you for your time, and I applaud the work you're doing. I was in the federal government for a long time, so I understand what it's like to be in a big bureaucracy, and you're doing great work in 3 different states, and you're great representatives of our school, and we certainly appreciate you taking time to come back with current students and prospective students to share your thoughts on working for the state. So with that, everybody, again, it looks like the sun is shining in most of your windows, so I hope it's warm, and I hope everyone gets a chance to go out and have a nice weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya.
Thank you.